Yes, yes. I mean, and that probably that's going to lead us to the very beginning. Let's start with that lonely entity called God, because at some point, if this entity pre-existed everything, is the Alpha, it's the very beginning. I'm trying to imagine the state of mind, if you wish, of that being. Why create it all?
So that's my first argument in the book. But what's interesting there, what's really interesting, and I talk about this in my Kalan cosmological argument book. So I wrote a book called Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalan cosmological argument, with a foreword by Jeffrey J. Lauder. So in that book, I talk about causally prior, because you can't really talk about before the universe was created, because in creating the universe, you're creating space-time. So therefore, you can't use temporal language. So the way around that is to say something like causally prior to God creating the universe, God would exist outside of time. And actually, William Lane Craig would agree with this. The problem with existing outside of time is you can have no personhood, because I would argue that all elements of personhood are temporal, like thinking and loving and having these things that are expressed or that take place over time. Like if I think and deliberate and then decide to do something, that's a very temporal thing. God can't do that because God doesn't exist in time. So therefore, there would just be an instance and then creation. You could argue that the universe is just as necessary of God. If you argue that God is a necessary being, you could say that if God is a necessary being, then God in an instant necessarily creates. Like there's no choice over that. It just happens, right? And therefore, that which is created is equally as necessary, arguably, as God. And so we get into this interesting argument that actually this is just as necessary and this is how it has to be, blah, blah, blah. But then we start thinking, well, what is God? What are these characteristics of God? Is God all powerful, all knowing and all loving? And what do those things mean? I would argue that you could imagine a God that is less than, but it wouldn't be the greatest thing you could imagine. And you're kind of devaluing your version of God. Fine, go for it. If you want a God that's evil, if you want to get, again, you've still got to present me with the evidence to support that. But I think for most theists, they would argue for the classical theism, which is the idea that God is all-knowing, knows everything, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and all-loving, omnibenevolent. And with that, you get divine foreknowledge, knows of all of future events before, anything happens. So, but of course, you can contest all those things. And the problem is when you argue with theists, they will say, well, that's not my version of God. So you kind of have to pick a version that does the most for the most people, which is, I think, classical theism.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a second here.
Yep.
And we'll use a bit of science and cosmology. Time is a very interesting property that some argue it doesn't actually really exist. And we know that in quantum mechanics, you can end up with something called retro causality, where the future can affect the past, because they're really nothing of that sort. The past, the future, and the present are product of finite minds living in a certain time era. But if you are an infinite being, time doesn't exist, because infinity plus 1 equals infinity, and infinity minus 2000 equals infinity.
I would have to challenge you what an infinite being actually means there. Are we talking an infinite set of... So I this idea of God being an infinite being is just like, it sounds lovely, doesn't it? But actually, really, what does that mean, theist? But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Basically, it means it's the same... We're going to give it the same quality, for the argument's sake, of the universe that Einstein proposed at some point. The steady-state theory. It's something that is always there. Never had a beginning. Was always there. It's a necessary being. It's something that was always been there. So you take that quality from the proposed existence with a capital E, which could be the universe, because now the conversation going to the Big Bang might be just a local event, and that's the beginning of our local universe. But then the actual existence of the ensemble of universes out there, of verses, could be infinite, and therefore they've always been there. You take that quality and give it to an intentional entity, rather than one that it just is not even aware that it exists, to one that is intentional, that is a mind, and give it the same quality, and voila, time evaporates.
There are indeed lots of competing theories of time, and the classic ones are the A theory and the B theory. You know, presentism, the idea that the present is fact, the past is been and gone, and the future is a potential. And that's what say, for example, William Lane Craig will use that in some kind of variation of that, and have he argues for an absolute time frame in the universe. But of course, special relativity says that, well, time is relative. Like, time is not the same here as it is over there, and that makes a mockery of that, which then causes problem for Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. But interestingly, so the B theory of time better accords with special relativity, such that you can argue for a block time universe where the past, the present, and the future are equally facts, and we just have maybe a spotlight of where we are in the universe, but it's all a fact in some kind of four-dimensional block universe. And of course, then you're completely invalidating free will right off the bat. Yeah, time is fascinating. I think it's interesting when a theist like William Lane Craig says, yeah, time doesn't exist until God creates it, and then in creating this universe, space-time, God enters into time. I don't know how that works then with the creation of other universes as well.
Very, very interesting, because when you think about it, the act of deciding something or thinking about something and then deciding to do it, and that's before creating. So the act of creation itself requires pondering, probably, and then creating, and that's temporal.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. So that none of that could happen. So it happens in an instant. So therefore, there's no thinking. There just is God existence. You know, and that's that. And an interesting argument, again, I mean, this is a very Kalam cosmological argument sort of area. And interestingly, what I talked about conceptual nominalism is a huge component of my approach to the Kalam, and it completely defeats the Kalam conceptual nominalism as opposed to Platonic realism, because things only begin to exist when our minds understand them beginning to exist. So, but I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I love that conversation. So causality is arguably a temporal thing, right? So, you know, there's a sequence to causality. A causes B causes C. Actually, I'd argue it's a big matrix, but, you know, things happen in a temporal fashion. If you don't have temporality, you don't have causality. You can't have causality, is one argument. In other words, if God is existing outside of time, God literally can't cause anything. So it's an argument to say that God actually couldn't cause the universe. It's breaking metaphysics, the metaphysics of causality. But again, it depends how you define causality.
This is fascinating. So if God was outside of time as we know it, and therefore sort of infinite, and then decided to create the universe.
Of course, couldn't decide, but yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But, you know, it does suggest time. There's got to be time spent there to do that. I mean, in the entire Christian theology, there is a bit of a delay there always. The logos, and it's also emphasized by the Quran and the doctrine of Islam, where when God, if he wants to have anything created, he needs to utter the word be, and then it is in the being. And when you think about it, a more powerful being would just think it, and it happens but the process of uttering a word that will have a certain time lag and delay, which is the logos here, and in the Islamic doctrine is uttering of a certain magic word to make creation happen. That is something really ridiculous when you think about it.
It's so anthropomorphic. You know, but these are creation stories that are written by humans that didn't necessarily understand these kind of ideas, and writing a thing that sounded brilliant and it fits in with their understanding of the universe. But you look back now and you think, yeah, no, we can't make sense of that. And why would God be constrained to only be able to create on uttering something? Of course, that means that God is constrained. Therefore, God is not omnipotent, and you know, it causes all sorts of problems.
It's so human, because, you know, us as kids go watching a magic show is not perfect until the magician.
Abracadabra! You said the magic word wrong. Yeah.
Or open sesame, you know, to open the cave for all the treasures behind. You know, there's a password, you know, and it's, you know, it's like the rite of passage. You got to say the right words and be in the right frame of mind, and it's insane. It's so human the way it's presented.
Yes, absolutely. And so what we have here, and the first argument in the book, we haven't even got to the first argument in the book, but the first argument of the book is entirely to do with this, which is, why did God create anything at all?